In the spring of 1978, Alma Reddick loosed 200 speckled guinea hens into the peach and apple orchard her husband had left her, an orchard the whole of Pell County had already written down as a place waiting to be cut for firewood. By the time the men at the Caldwell feed store had drained their first pot of coffee, the county had a name for her. They called her the Guinea Woman, and they laughed about it for 2 long seasons, right up until the summer the curculio and the beetles came down out of the ridges like a slow brown judgment and stripped every sprayed grove for 40 miles to bare wood and wormy drops, every grove but hers. She had not gone soft in the head after burying her husband. She had read a thing in a dead woman's hand that not one of those men had the patience to read. Alma was 57 years old that spring, lean and rangy, with the kind of shoulders that came from a lifetime of lifting what most folks would have set down. Her hands were broad and large-knuckled, the skin across the back of them gone to a soft brown leather, and she kept them mostly in the pockets of a faded barn coat when she stood still, which was rare. She wore a wide-brimmed felt hat the color of a wet fence post, and under it her gray-streaked hair was pinned back plain. Her eyes were a pale stubby gray that did not plead and did not flinch, and when a man talked down to her, which was often that first year, she looked at him as a person looks at coming weather. She did not argue. She had never once in her life argued a man out of a thing he wanted to believe. She simply went home and did the work. The orchard sat on 40 acres of gentle slope east of the Caldwell Road, 70-year-old peach trees on the lower ground, and a stand of older apples up the rise. And it had been her husband Tom's pride and, in the end, the thing that outlived him. He had sprayed it faithfully for 30 years, as every orchard man in Pell County sprayed, and he had kept the little brown notebooks of what he sprayed and when, stacked in a drawer in the pack house like sermons nobody read twice. When Tom went, in the winter of '77, quiet in his sleep with his boots by the stove, the county assumed the orchard would go with him, because everyone knew that a widow past 50 could not keep up a spray schedule, could not haul the drums, could not read the wind in the calendar closely enough to poison a grove clean. What everyone knew in Pell County in those years was that a fruit orchard lived or died by the sprayer. You kept the ground bare and clean under the trees. You ran the mist blower every 10 days from petal fall clear to picking, arsenet, and in the newer things after, and you did it whether it rained or shined. Because the plum curculio and the codling moth and a Japanese beetle did not take a summer off, and a single mist round could turn a whole crop to scarred and dropping ruin. That was the orthodoxy, and it was not foolish. The men who believed it were not fools. Their fathers had lost orchards learning it. It was simply the only way anyone in that country had ever seen a clean peach grown, and so when Alma Reddick let the spray drum sit empty in the pack house and turned 200 noisy birds loose under the trees instead, they did not see a method. They saw a woman losing her grip. If you have ever watched a whole town decide that a steady, capable person had simply gone to pieces, then you already understand the country this story comes from, and you understand why it needs telling. Stay with Alma. What the men at that feed store were about to learn was already written down, in pencil, in a cracked oilcloth ledger that sat on Alma's kitchen table under a jar lid full of peach pits, and not one of them would think to ask what was in it until it was far too late to matter. The ledger had not been Alma's. It had belonged to Verna, Tom's older sister, a woman who had died the year Alma married into the family and whom Alma had met exactly twice. Verna had run an orchard of her own once, down in the Ozark country before the war, and she had run it strange, by all accounts, strange enough that the family spoke of her in the lowered voice they saved for a hard winter or a scandal. Tom had kept her ledger without ever reading past the first pages, and Alma had found it the week after the funeral while she was clearing the pack house. Wrapped in the same waxed cloth Verna had wrapped it in 40 years before. She read it at the kitchen table over 3 nights, a kerosene lamp pulled close because the pencil had faded, and what she found there was not a diary and not a Bible, though it had the weight of both. It was a system, page after page in Verna's faded hand, listing what she had turned loose in her trees and what those creatures ate, and when, and in what numbers, and what the crop had done in answer. Alma read the pages as another woman might have read letters from a son at war, and by the 3rd night she had stopped grieving quite so hard, because she had found a thing to do. She did not tell the county what she had found. That was the first thing the men held against her. Later, when they were being honest, if you could call it that, she had a reason and she had a plan, and she never once stood among them and explained herself. And folks do not forgive being left out of a thing nearly so much as they forgive being wrong. Alma understood that about people. She had simply decided that she had buried enough of her life explaining herself to men who had already made up their minds, and that she would spend what she had left doing instead of saying. In April, she drove her husband's truck 2 counties over to a hatchery she had found the address for in the back of a farm paper, and she came home with the birds in slatted crates stacked to the cab roof. 200 keats no bigger than a child's fist, gray and speckled and screaming. She raised them through the cold weeks in the brooder end of the barn, and when they had feathered out into the ash-gray, white-spotted, bald-faced things that guinea fowl become, birds that looked less like poultry than like something a fever had dreamed up. She carried them in crates to the orchard, and she opened the doors and let them go. They went up into the trees and out along the rows in a spreading, muttering flood, and from that day forward they never once stopped moving. Guinea fowl do not scratch and settle the way a chicken does. They range. They walk the ground in loose companies all day long, heads down, working every inch of it. And they go up into the low branches and along the trunks, and they keep up a rolling clatter of noise that carries a mile on a still morning. By the 2nd week, the whole east end of the county could hear Alma Reddick's orchard before they could see it, and a name was fixed. The Guinea woman. It was not said kindly. The man who said it least kindly was Orrin Pruitt, whose land ran along Alma's western fence and whose orchard was the biggest and cleanest in Pell County. Orrin was a heavy, easy, smiling man in his early 60s who wore a good hat and a pressed shirt to do business in, and who had wanted the Reddick 40 for 20 years because it held the morning sun and a spring that never failed, and it fit against his own ground like a missing tooth. He had made Tom an offer once and been told no, gently, and then he had settled in to wait, as patient men do, for the ground to fall to him some other way. A widow with no children and a head full of foolishness about birds seemed to Orrin a matter of time. He came to the fence the first week the guineas were out, leaning his forearms on the top rail in the friendly manner he had. And he told Alma that he was worried about her. That was how he put it. He was worried. A grove wants spraying, Alma, he said, and a woman alone can't run a mist blower, and there's no shame in that. I'll give you a fair price. You keep the house and the garden ground as long as you live. He said it all in the warm, reasonable voice of a man doing a kindness. Alma stood on her side of the rail with a bucket of feed on her arm and let him finish. "I'm obliged for the worry," she said. "The trees are spoke for." That was the whole of it. She picked up her bucket and walked back into the muttering gray tide of birds, and Orrin Pruitt watched her go, with the smile still on his face, and something colder settling in behind it, and he drove back into town and told the men over their coffee that grief had gotten the better of her judgment, and they agreed, and the laughing took on a mean edge after that. There was a wife on the Pruitt place, Cora, a small, straight-backed woman who had married Orrin when they were both young and who had watched him gather land his whole life as another man might gather grievances. She heard him tell the Guinea woman's story at his own supper table, heard him laugh about the noise and the smell and the folly of it, and she set his plate down in front of him a little harder than she needed to. "Orrin Pruitt," she said, "that woman put her husband in the ground 11 months ago, and here you sit at my table laughing at her. You will leave her be." "I'm doing her a kindness, Cora," he said. "Somebody's got to." "You are doing yourself a kindness," Cora said, "and calling it hers. There's a difference, and you know it." He did not answer that, which was its own kind of answer, and Cora did not raise it again out loud. But she began, quietly, to send things across the fence. A pie left on the porch rail. A word at church. She was the first person in Pell County to cross to Alma's side, and she did it without ever quite admitting she had. The daily work of it was not glamorous, and the county saw only the noise. What they did not see was Alma out among the trees at first light every morning of that spring and summer, walking the rows slow with a ledger in her coat pocket, watching what the birds did. Verna's pages had told her what to look for, and she looked for it. She watched the guineas work the ground under the peach trees in the hour after dawn, heads bobbing. And she saw them snap up the small, hard-shelled things that moved in the grass and the fallen petals, the beetles and the weevils, and the little curved snout curculio that no chicken would bother with and no man could see without getting down on his knees in the dirt. She watched them take the Japanese beetles off the leaves in the heat of the day, jumping and clattering after them. And she watched them pace the orchard floor after every windfall, cleaning the drops before the worms in them could crawl back into the ground. She wrote it all in the ledger under Verna's 40-year-old lines, in her own hand now, keeping the count as Verna had kept it before her. And here is the thing she did not say to a living soul. The thing that was the whole quiet engine of that orchard and the reason this story is worth an hour of your evening, she never once told the county what the birds were for. She let them think she had turned 200 noisemakers loose because a lonely widow wanted company. She let the joke stand, because the joke cost her less than the truth would have, and because a woman who has learned a thing the hard way learns also to keep it and hold it close until the season comes that shows it. There was a boy in all this, or a young man, rather, Orrin and Cora's only son, Wendell, who was 26 that year and worked his father's orchard and had never in his life had a thought his father had not thought first. Wendell drove past the Reddick place twice a day, going in and out of town, and where his father saw folly he found himself over that first summer watching, he saw that the Guinea woman's trees, for all the noise around them, looked no worse than anyone's. He saw her walking the rows at dawn when he went by early, slow and steady, a woman doing something on purpose. He said nothing to his father, but he began to slow the truck a little when he passed, and to look. The first real test came at the end of that first summer, and it came, as these things do, from a man with a clipboard. The county extension agent, a careful young fellow named Delbert Hoss, who took his soil bulletins as gospel, heard about the sprayless orchard east of town and drove out to see it, because it was his job to see such things and to file a report on them. He walked Alma's rows with his clipboard, and he found what a man looking for failure will always find. He found scarred fruit. He found a peach here and there with the little crescent scar the curculio leaves, drops on the ground that the birds had not yet reached, a lower count on the young trees than the spray books said there ought to be. He wrote it up plain. The Reddick orchard, he reported to the county board, was running above the acceptable damage threshold and could not be recommended as a sound practice, and a copy of that report was read aloud over the coffee in town within the week, and it was the worst day Alma had that whole first year. Because the men had been laughing, but a clipboard is not a laugh. A clipboard is the county itself saying you are wrong, in ink, on paper, and Orrin Pruitt made sure a copy found its way onto the seat of Alma's truck. That was the night Alma came the closest she ever came to selling. She sat at the kitchen table a long time with the extension report on one side and Verna's ledger on the other, and the birds gone quiet in the dark trees. And she did the arithmetic of a woman alone. She was $62 behind on the note. The apples had not come in heavy. A careful young man with a clipboard had written down in the county's own book that she was a fool. And Orrin Pruitt's offer sat warm and reasonable in the back of her mind. The house for life, the garden ground, no more explaining. She did not sell. She opened the ledger instead and read Verna's faded pencil by lamplight, and she found the page she had gone back to a dozen times, the page where Verna had written in the second year of her own orchard almost the same account of a bad frost season, scarred fruit, and a low count, and neighbors who talked. And under it Verna had left a single line, and Alma read it out loud to the empty kitchen, in the voice of a woman 40 years dead. The birds are slow because they are learning the ground, Alma read. Next year they will know it. The year after that, no worm will cross it. She closed the cover and went to bed and got up the next morning and walked the rows at first light, same as always. She had chosen the orchard one more dawn. That is the whole of what courage is, most of the time. It is getting up and doing the same quiet thing one more morning than the people watching you thought you would. If you yourself have ever brought a thing back from an old ledger nobody else would read and carried it alone while the county laughed, then this is your story too, and you already know that Alma was right and the clipboard was wrong. Stay with her. The second year is where it turned. The second summer, the birds knew the ground. Delbert Hoss had said the orchard ran above threshold, but Delbert Hoss had counted it in the wrong year. In the second season, the guinea flock worked those 40 acres like a single slow machine, and the scarred fruit thinned, and the drops got cleaner, and the count on the young peach trees came up strong. And if the county had bothered to send its clipboard out again, it would have had to write something it did not want to write. But the county did not send a clipboard again. The county had laughed itself into a story it liked, and it was in no hurry to check the story against the trees. Orrin Pruitt kept his own orchard the way he always had, clean ground and a mist blower every 10 days. And it was a fine orchard, and he was not wrong to be proud of it. His fruit went to the packing shed in Caldwell in graded boxes, and his name meant something. He had no reason on earth that second summer to think that the Guinea woman next door was doing anything but slowly going under, and every reason to think the 40 acres would be his inside 3 years. He was patient. He could wait. He did not have to wait as long as he thought. The Beetle year came in the third summer, the summer of 1980, and it did not announce itself. It came as real disasters come, which is quietly and then all at once. The spring had been warm and wet, the kind of spring that fruit men love and fear in the same breath, because everything that wants to grow, grows. And everything that wants to eat the fruit breeds in numbers nobody has seen in 20 years. The curculio came first, up out of the leaf litter and the ridge woods in a wave, the little humpback snout beetles laying into the young fruit across the whole county in the 2 weeks after petal fall. Then the Japanese beetles came behind them in a metallic green flood that ate the leaves down to lace, and the codling moth after that, and the plum moth, all of them at once, a convergence of pests that the old men would talk about over their coffee for the rest of their lives. And the spray could not hold it. That was the thing nobody was ready for. The orchards were sprayed hard, sprayed on the 10-day schedule and then on a 7-day schedule, and then, as the panic rose, sprayed almost continuously, and it did not matter, because the numbers were simply too great, and the weather washed the poison off as fast as the men could put it on. Orrin Pruitt ran his mist blower until it burned out a bearing, and he borrowed another and ran that one. And still he stood in his own clean rows in the last week of June and watched the curculio scar his peaches faster than he could count them, watched the beetles strip his leaves, watched the drops pile up under the trees full of worms that would be next year's plague. And there was nothing in any drum in his pack house that could stop it. By the middle of July, it was plain across every township in the county that the crop was lost. Grove after grove, the clean sprayed groves that had been the pride of the county, stood stripped and scarred, the fruit dropping wormy and small 40 miles of ruined orchards under a hard, bright summer sky. The packing shed in Caldwell sat half idle. The men did not laugh at the feed store that July. They sat quiet over their coffee and did the arithmetic of a lost year. And it was Cora Pruitt, of all people, who said the thing out loud first at the church supper in her small, straight-backed voice. Somebody ought to drive out past the Reddick place, Cora said. And look at what the Guinea woman's got. They did not believe her at first. But Wendell Pruitt believed her, because Wendell had been slowing his truck on the Caldwell Road for 2 summers, and Wendell drove out the next morning before his father was up, and what he saw made him stop the truck in the middle of the road and get out and stand at the fence with his hat in his hands, though there was no one there to take his hat off to but the trees. On the other side of Alma Reddick's fence, in the middle of a county stripped to bare wood, there was fruit. Heavy, clean peaches bending the branches down, apples coming on hard and sound up the rise, leaves whole and green, the ground under the trees clean of drops and worms, and moving through all of it in the early light. In a loose, muttering gray company, 200 strong, the guinea fowl. Working, heads down, snapping up every beetle and weevil and curculio that came off the ridges, walking the ground clean as they had walked it clean each morning across 2 long years of laughter, so that when the plague year came, there was simply nothing left alive in that orchard to eat the fruit. The birds had gotten there first. They had gotten there first every single day for 2 seasons, and now, in the 1 year it mattered more than all the rest, they stood as the only thing between clean fruit and ruin in the whole of the county, knowing nothing of it and never slowing. Here is the mechanism, the thing Verna had written in pencil 40 years before, and Alma had held to herself through 2 long seasons of laughter. The how that the hook of this story withheld, and the trees now paid off in full. A guinea fowl is a poor scratching bird and a worse layer, and that is why no orchard man would keep 200 of them. But it is the finest insect hunter that walks on 2 legs. It ranges all day, it never settles, and it will eat the hard-shelled ground and foliage insects that a chicken turns its beak up at. The very beetles and weevils and snout-nosed curculio that ruin an orchard, and it will do it without ever pecking the fruit or barking the bark, because it wants the bug and not the peach. Turn enough of them loose in a grove and keep them there year-round, and they break the life cycle of the pest at its root in the soil, eating this year's beetles before they can lay next year's, clearing the drops before the worms inside them crawl back into the ground, so that season on season the pressure falls instead of building. It is not a spray. It is slower than a spray, and it takes a pair of seasons to prove and a strong stomach to wait through, but when the plague comes and the poison fails, an orchard that has been walked clean by 200 birds every dawn for 2 summers has no plague left in it, because the plague was eaten a year before it could hatch. Alma had not invented any of it. She had read it in Verna's ledger, and Verna had not invented it either, but had it from a great aunt in the old country who ran fowl in a walnut grove, and so the knowledge was older than the county laughing at it, older than the sprayers, older than the notion that a grove wanted poisoning at all. It had simply been forgotten, as patient, slow things are always forgotten, in favor of the loud, fast thing that works right up until the year it doesn't. Wendell Pruitt went home and told his father, and Orrin did not believe him, and drove out to the fence himself in the heat of that afternoon, and stood where his son had stood, and saw the same thing, heavy clean fruit and green leaves and 200 birds working, across the fence from his own stripped and ruined rows. He stood there a long while. Then Alma came down through the trees with her bucket, because a man at her rail was a thing she had learned to answer, and Orrin Pruitt did the one honest thing left to him, which was to say it out loud, to her face, in the open. "You knew," he said, "all this time. You knew what they'd do, and you let us laugh." "I knew what the book said," Alma answered. "You could have asked what was in it. You'd rather have the 40 acres than the answer." "I'd have called you a fool if you'd told me," he said, "same as I did anyway." "I know it," she said. "That's why I didn't tell you." And Orrin had no answer to that, none at all, because it was true, and he was a proud man, and it had cost him his whole crop to hear it. To his credit, he did not drive back into town afterward and pretend he had not seen the trees. He went home and sat at his own supper table across from Cora, who did not say a word, because she did not need to. And here is the part the county would remember, the part that made it a story and not just a good year for one orchard. Alma Reddick did not gloat. There is no scene in all of this where she stands in town and tells the men what they can do with their mist blowers. She was not made for that, and neither is this kind of story. When the county came to her fence, and it did come, in ones and twos all through that ruined August, hats in hands, she did not make them small. She met them at the rail as plainly as she had met Orrin Pruitt 2 springs before, steady, a bucket on her arm, and she answered what they asked, and no more. One of the first to come was a lean, sunburned orchard man from the North End named Elias Tremont, who had lost every peach he owned and who did not know how to ask a woman for help he had spent 2 years mocking. He stood at Alma's rail turning his hat in his hands a long moment before he could get the words out. "I don't rightly know how to say this," Elias said at last. "Then say it plain," Alma told him. "Plain is quickest. My grove's gone, every tree, and yours is standing." He looked out at the birds moving under her peaches. "I laughed at those infernal birds, same as everyone. I want to know how they did it. If you'll tell a man who don't deserve to be told." "The birds don't care who deserves what," Alma said. "They just eat the bug." She set her bucket on the rail between them. "You want to learn it? You come back in the morning and walk the rows with me at first light, and you keep coming till you've seen a full season. There's no trick to sell you. There's only the walking and the 2 years of waiting and the not quitting when the county says quit." 2 years, Elias said, and something in him seemed to sag at the size of it. 2 years, she agreed. "It's slow. That's the whole of why it works, and the whole of why nobody keeps it." And Elias Tremont came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and he was one of the men who carried the method into the North Townships before the decade was out. Wendell was the first of the Pruitts to actually cross, and he crossed as the youngest and least guilty always cross first. He came up the lane on foot one evening with his hat against his chest, and he stood in the yard and asked Alma if she would teach him what she knew about the birds. And when she looked at him, he said the thing that Alma would remember for the rest of her life. The thing that told her the county had truly turned. "My father didn't send me," Wendell said. "He doesn't know I'm here. I just want to learn it before it's forgotten." Alma set down her bucket and looked at the boy a long moment, and then she took him into the orchard in the last of the light and began quietly to teach him. And that was the beginning of the method, leaving that 140-acre grove and going out into the county, not through a report or a bulletin, but by the same route it had reached Alma in the first place, from one patient person to one willing person, hand to hand. The public apology, such as it was, came from Silas Dunmore, who had run the loudest of the laughing in town, and who owned a middling orchard south of Caldwell that the Beetles had taken as hard as any. Silas was not a graceful man, and he did not make a graceful apology, but he made one, which was more than most. He came to Alma's fence in September and took his cap off and held it in both hands. "I called you a fool for 2 seasons running," he said, "and I was wrong the whole while, and I'd be obliged to know how you did it." And Alma told him plainly, no charge and no gloating, and Silas Dunmore went home and started reading about guinea fowl, and within 3 years there were flocks of them working orchards in 4 townships where before there had been only the mist blower and a poison drum. The clipboard came back too, in the end, though it came back changed. Delbert Hoss, the extension agent who had written her up in the first year, drove out that fall on his own without a report to file and asked if he might walk the rows and count. He counted for 2 days. And what he found he could not unfind, and being a more honest man than the county had a right to expect, he did not bury it. He wrote up the good year as plainly as he had once written the bad one, and he sent it up the line to the state university, and in time a man came down from there to see it for himself. The man from the university was a soft-spoken professor of entomology named Harlan Boyce, and he spent the better part of 2 seasons on Alma Reddick's 40 acres with his own notebooks. And he did what the county could not do, which was to give the thing its right name and put it in the permanent record. He wrote a paper on the orchard east of Caldwell, on the integrated control of orchard pests by ranging fowl, and in that paper he did the one thing Alma asked of him, which was that he not leave Verna out of it. He wrote that the method had been carried in a family ledger for 2 generations before the operator revived it, and he named the ledger, and he named the county, and he made the orchard a study site that other growers came to see for years afterward. The folk thing that the feed store had laughed at for 2 years had a proper name now, and a place in a book and a dead woman's hand behind it. Finally, read. Orrin Pruitt sold his mist blower 2 years later and put guinea fowl in his own orchard, and he never quite apologized to Alma in words, being the man he was, but he sent Wendell over to work the 2 flocks together, and he stopped all at once talking about buying the Reddick 40. Some kinds of apology are a thing a man does with his hands and his son and his silence, because his mouth cannot manage it, and Alma took it in the spirit it was meant. Cora Pruitt and Alma became, in the last years, the kind of friends that only 2 women who have watched the same foolishness from opposite sides of a fence can become. Alma kept the orchard another 12 years, and she kept the ledger, and she kept writing in it, her own hand under Verna's, the counts and the seasons and the slow-falling pressure of the pests, so that when she was gone the next person to open that oilcloth cover would find 2 generations of a working orchard written down in pencil, waiting to be read. She left the 40 acres to Wendell Pruitt, who had crossed the fence first and asked to learn before it was forgotten, and she left the ledger with the land. She did not leave anyone a lecture, and she did not leave anyone a grievance. She left a working orchard and a book that explained it, which is the only kind of legacy that has ever been worth leaving. There is no monument east of Caldwell. There is a stand of old peach and apple trees, still worked, still clean, and if you drive past on a still morning, you can hear it before you can see it. 200 birds in a loose gray company, muttering and clattering, working the ground as they have worked it for the better part of 50 years now, keeping a thing alive that a whole county once laughed at and then, one ruined summer, could not live without. There is one of these stories in every county in America, a person who kept a patient slow thing while the world laughed at the loud fast one, and was proven right in a single hard season, and asked for nothing after but to be allowed to keep on. If you have ever been that person, or loved one, then you already knew how this story had to end. And you already know it was never really about the birds. If you've made it this far into Alma Reddick's story, then you are the kind of person these stories are for, and I would be glad to keep telling them. Leave a comment and tell us what your grandmother kept that the neighbors laughed at, and subscribe so the next one finds you. There is a story like this in every county in America, and we are working through them one harvest at a time. So here at the end, I will leave it to you. If the Beetle year came to your county tomorrow, and every sprayed grove for 40 miles went to ruin, would you rather have been the man with the finest mist blower in the county? Or would you rather have been the Guinea woman who read the old book and got up one more morning than anyone thought she would?